received any dispute or complaints in the province. This despite the EFF, APC and BRA calling for a rerun on Monday's local government elections in Bushbuckridge. The parties are alleging that ballot boxes were tampered with, but the IEC says that no complaint was lodged with the commission. In another incident, the residents of Matafin claim there were more ballot papers compared to the number of people on the voters' roll.
The procedure is, if there's something that they are disputing, they are expected to lodge a grievance or to lodge an objection with the office. But so far, nothing has been submitted formally so to the office. The only avenue is for them to submit an objection. Then everything will be put on hold. The commission will be expected to deal with that objection. Then, after the commission has dealt with the objection, they will make a ruling on the findings, whether those are founded to be true or not. So all depends to them submitting an objection. Then the objection will be taken to the commission to look at the objection and then make a ruling.
Now, in the past elections, we've seen a lot of political parties, in fact, come into the political state of play and also being part of the system. But some have said that this may not be, effective when it comes to leveling the playing field. This week, though, it seems to have been local organizations and individuals doing the bulk of this work. What can we attribute this shift to? Now, politics and public policy lecturer at Tshwane University of Technology, Mr. Levi Ndo, as well as political analyst and social commentator, Mr. Soli Masilela, are still with us to have this particular conversation as we then look at this mandate that the voters would have given the political parties, especially when you're juxtaposing it with the voter turnout that has been of grave concern. Now, gentlemen, before we continue with this conversation, I'm looking at the board. We haven't moved. We are still at 58% of the votes. I know that this is an intricate counting process, but it cannot be this slow.
Well, I think there might be some factors that we need to look at. Firstly, there is the level of anxiety is very high among South Africans. I know that there are people who would not sleep until the final ballot has actually been counted. But I think there is one other area that we need to look at, which will require the IEC as well to make some improvements. The projections as made by the IEC has been that they would have counted almost 90% by last night. And of course, if we're still at 58 now, it should be an area of concern. It might be beyond the IEC because we're now talking about load shedding. ESCOM has decided to implement stage 2 load shedding. Maybe those are some of the factors that are actually contributing to the slow pace of the results actually coming in. But that does not put South Africa in a positive light. We've got international observers. I expect maybe some of them wanted to leave as early as 10 o'clock this morning after everything has been done. They've actually done their work. They've observed. They've seen. Now everything is now going to be delayed because of our own incapacities to deliver on very basic things. One would have expected the electricity provider to have prioritized elections and ensure that everything has to run smoothly. But the ESCOM that we have in South Africa, I think I will blame them for bringing us into this situation because we should have been moving much smoother and in a much better pace.
Mr. Masilela, for me, then, if I listen to this, it's worrisome because it means that the plans to then have everything done by the 4th may not materialize. If we are still at 58% now, with an IEC that said at 8 o'clock yesterday in the evening that they are planning to be at 90%, and this morning they were only going to be dealing with 10%, but essentially they're now going to be dealing with 42%, and I don't know if that is...
I think we must just prepare ourselves for another night coming tomorrow. But the serious matter, Bongiwe, is why commit? I mean, leadership in terms of committing. Why commit and say by 8 o'clock we shall have done with 90%? Secondly, maybe due to unforeseen circumstances, you can't meet that particular target. Why not communicate? Why not try and communicate that I made this commitment, but because of some, even if you don't mention the reasons actually per se, but just, allays the expectations of the people to whom you have committed the 90%. I'm surprised when one official from Mpumalanga, IEC, suggests, unless if she's referring to a particular VD, but when he speaks about Mpumalanga generally, I'm aware that there are many disputes which has been registered in Mpumalanga, which might be the case in terms of the stagnation of the counting or whatever. But my worry is provide leadership, communicate. We no human is infallible. We know, we accept that, but communicate to the people, particularly if you committed to a particular target. So it leaves people, as the Prof is saying, I mean, we have international observers here, it just leaves people in disarray. Some are not going to sleep, keep on postponing and saying maybe in an hour's time, maybe in an hour's time. It's not proper leadership if we handle the matter in that way.
The disputes that we are hearing about in Mpumalanga will not be unique to Mpumalanga, because this was a fiercely contested election, as have been many others, but this one was really the hotbed, and it really, as some have said, a litmus test of what the national election might just be in the coming years. That in and itself, is of course something that should be taken seriously, because the IEC has to make sure that every box is ticked before they call anything, because things could end up at the electoral court. That might mean then that we might find ourselves with the delays that we had. Remember in 2016, the delays we had in calling Johannesburg were really, really some serious delays, and might then see us extend this into the weekend.
It will be quite unfortunate to have this kind of a situation. There is an acknowledgement by the IEC. The day before yesterday, they said normally they would love to have more than 80 days for a preparation of the elections, but this time they had very few days to finalize the preparations for the elections. That might be a factor at play. But also, there are instances where you sometimes deal with human behavior, which would require the IEC to be able to identify right people, to be able to perform this responsibility in a manner that the elections are not tainted at all. The mandate given to the IEC is quite clear, that they should actually make sure that issues that will relate to disputes should actually be prevented at all costs. But I think what is also very important is that we need then to look at the variety of aspects that will lead to the declaration of the final results. Looking at the elections in general, look at issues that relate to violence, look at issues that are associated with some form of suspicions, and the issues that are being raised in different VDs. And based on all those, the IEC should then be able to come back to all of us and say, on this matter, this is what we've done, or this is how we've actually been able to resolve on this matter. And the history that we've had with the IEC in South Africa has been that the IEC has always been able to deliver on its mandate in all the elections. And one would also expect that to be the case even now. But you need the IEC that would see every opportunity where there has been mistakes to be a learning curve so that such mistakes do not happen in the future. And we're heading towards the general elections. One would not expect the mistakes that actually happened now to happen in the next elections, because then would say that the IEC has not learned anything and they're not prepared to correct on the mistakes that they've actually encountered. For now, they must actually come back to us and say, this is how we've actually been able to handle these matters, and this is how we're actually going to be able to move forward.
I wonder if the 80 days would have made any difference when it comes to preparation, especially when you're looking at voter turnout. We just saw a video of, people who are opting to either be at the beach and say that they'd rather spend the day with their families than to waste a day voting for. One even said, I'm supporting other people. Others even saying that there's so much corruption, I don't even think I should be voting. So would the 80 days have made any difference had they had sufficient time to prepare for this election when it comes to the voter turnout that has been so dismal?
You see, what we must acknowledge, Bongiwe, is that particularly the period leading up to these elections, the IEC has been exposed to some serious challenges. When you take into consideration the issue of the COVID-19, their application to the Constitutional Court for the postponement, my suspicion is that probably they hoped on the Constitutional Court that it will agree with them to postpone the election, and it never materialized. Then they were caught back-footed. They had to quickly, I doubt even they had time to train their officials on the ground properly, as they are normally doing every year because of that. Then taking that whole picture into consideration, one then can begin to say probably even the 80 days period wouldn't have that much assistance to the IEC itself, given the planning, and also given the fact that they reported that they are testing certain new technologies within the whole system, and testing a technological equipment in itself is experimentation, which will come up with some technical glitches there and there and all those things. On that front, one really understands the whole setup, but my take is communicate. Don't commit, don't overcommit, and don't raise expectations, and you don't fulfill those particular commitments. That leads to the perceptions around the integrity of the elections. Not only the integrity of the elections, also around the capability and the capacity of IEC beginning to impact negatively on the history which they've created all these years. But if you communicate, people will understand, particularly given the environment within which these elections were held.
Do you think, though, that the technology may be something that some political parties who are not happy with this result use to even take their fight to the electoral court? Because we heard political parties yesterday saying that some people were being turned away. The system is offline. The system, the network doesn't even work. It's not picking up some voters. Could we see this then play out in a court of law?
One can't rule that out because, the IE itself confirmed that there are people who were turned away, who were not on the registrar and all those things because of those technological mechanisms. I've listened to the representative of the EFF. She was really adamant on that they can't lose votes because of a technological equipment belonging to the IEC itself. So one can't overrule that, particularly looking at the principles within the Constitution and also within the Electoral Act itself, that of fairness in terms of conducting elections. And that begin, when you look at the broader framework of elections, that begin now to impact negatively on enriching democracy through periodical elections in our country, and which will be a serious challenge.
What does it do to the credibility of the election then, if there are these kinds of concerns that are hanging above this particular election? Because it may be called, and political parties may decide to say, okay, we'll let it slide. But you'll always have the issue of the phasing out of the zip machine with this new one now, which then created a lot of problems, hang above the selection, and they might use it even in their arguments as we inch closer to the general election.
You know, if you look at the developments that took place prior to the elections, you had the IEC that came out to say, now that we have got COVID-19, would it be possible for us to run for the elections? And the same IEC came with the commission that was headed by former Deputy Justice Museneke. And whilst the commission was busy with its work, the IEC said, we are not entirely worried about COVID-19 because we've always been ready to run for the elections. And some of the political parties came up to say, you are busy launching the logo for the 2021 elections, but we have got a commission. The very same IEC wanted a pronouncement by the courts whether elections should continue or not, looking at the situation. So you have got the IEC that was doubting whether these elections should continue, but at the same time making an assurance that as the commission we are quite ready. But the same commission comes in when the elections are on to say, normally we need 80 days to prepare, but now we've been given less days. Whilst in the past the same commission was saying we are always ready. So those are some of the issues, that has a potential to raise questions from ordinary citizens, and some political parties might then decide to use this one against the commission if you package all these statements that are coming from the commission and the developments that took place towards the 1st of November.
I wonder what then does that mean for not only the perceptions and the observations of the ordinary South Africans, but the trust in the processes then, because we're going into coalition spaces in all likelihoods. That's where we're going to find ourselves. Then the Electoral Commission has got such challenges even during this particular election. How then does an ordinary South African believe to trust that the process is working in both ends here? Because the coalition agreements are not being made public. They don't know what they're agreeing to. The Electoral Commission also is having its own challenges. Does this then put us in a very dangerous terrain of an even further decline in a turnout when it comes to the general elections?
The IEC, it's an institution that is created to enrich our democracy and ensure that democracy works. And this is the institution that has to ensure at all costs that when it comes to democracy in action in South Africa, this is the institution that should be at the forefront. And if we find ourselves in a situation where there's a greater portion of the citizens who seem to be losing trust in the vote or in the election processes, that will then put the IEC on the spotlight, and unfortunately for negative things. And I think also it remains a learning curve, but something has to be done by the IEC to ensure that when it comes to a vote, when it comes to voter registration and voter education, the IEC has to be at the forefront. And I find that to be an area that is wanting. Political parties in South Africa, and I want to emphasize this one, would always do the IEC a very big favor, because you always see political parties being the ones who are encouraging people to go and register as voters. Even though political parties at the end of the day would be the beneficiaries, they also play a very, very significant role in assisting the IEC in fulfilling its mandate. But in my view, the IEC should also do more in order to ensure that there is sufficient education on voting, teaching ordinary citizens about the importance of voting, and in particular the focus on the youth. We had a lot of celebration in the last voter registration week that a lot of young people have actually registered to vote. But when it comes to the actual voting activity, we don't see young people participating in the vote. And I think it will require the IEC to go back to its drawing board to ensure that indeed we have got much bigger numbers of the people that are actually participating in the vote.
Could an electronic system of voting change maybe young people who might prefer to do things from their devices than to leave their homes? Could that change the game maybe and improve the turnout?
You know, any effort and any attempt to enrich the process of adding value to the democratization of the country will be really appreciated. Probably one of the tools, as you are suggesting, can also help. I don't know what are the reasons why is it not, probably it is looked into somewhere, particularly given Bongiwe, our history as a country, where we come from in terms of holding elections and managing elections. That might also bring also the demography of our country and the challenges which we are facing, the electricity and all those things. Those are the things packaged together which might be addressed to consider an alternative means, because unless if we don't look deeper in, also fast-tracking the technological, it needs to be gradual and be spread accordingly, because it goes with a lot of efforts in terms of training, in terms of civic education, in terms of ensuring that it is clearly intrinsically understood by the voters themselves, because the important role players here are the voters. I can imagine, Bongiwe, the glitches which was experienced by the IEC yesterday, some voting districts not open on time, and people run impatience, particularly African people in our country. They not so much cultured into voting, allowing them to creating a situation where they must queue, you haven't opened, they become impatient, and some of them will leave and everything. And yet when the IEC was reporting, they were suggesting that those people who were not registered, they've sent them SMSs to come back and vote again. I'm asking myself, that is an extra effort on an individual, given the voter apathy we find ourselves in.
When you talk about the training, I can't help but think about the coalition arrangements and the fact that maybe they themselves might also need some kind of training, because one of the things we're talking about was the IDP.
Yeah.
Because this integrated development plan is supposed to make sure that everyone is not working in silos.
Yes.
And everything is linked to the other, so that you can track development and you can see how far you are.
Exactly.
Shouldn't then, while the voters are being tasked with this particular part of the responsibility of training, those that are supposed to also then be looking after their interests at council then be trained as well in order to ensure that they enter into such coalition agreements with the right kind of mindset and guarding against what Mr. Ndo was talking about, the rules that are set at national that must then govern what happens in council?
You know, the interesting part related to the question you are raising around the IDP and also the management and the understanding, the training around that particular important developmental tool is that at municipal level, decisions are taken on the basis of caucuses outside council itself. Political parties are caucusing outside, taking decisions on the implementation of the very same IDP. I think this is where the disjuncture crops in, because once the municipality adopt that particular IDP as a developmental tool, you must understand that it's a document which came as a result of consultation with communities on their needs in terms of service delivery. Now, when it collapses within the municipality, you expect that all role players will just collaborate and collapse themselves behind this particular document. And it's a what-based developmental document. Hence, I wonder, most municipalities, as I said earlier on, are not budgeting according to their awards. In terms of budgeting, they just put their entire annual budget in one basket and wait to be reactionary when there is a protest there and there. They put money and all those things, which then begin to affect what you call. Also, the coalition, they need to be trained, as we are saying, and workshopped to collapse the coalition operational models within the IDP. That will begin to minimize this disintegrated approach towards development. It will play a critical role. There are tools, Bongi, where there are laws, there are legislations in all the spheres of government, which, if complied with, which when implemented with a single objective of ensuring that the lives of the people are bettered, we won't have a challenge.
I'm going to pause for a second as we go to my colleague Ndumiso Cingo, because one of the things you talk about, Mr. Masilela, is the ward-based budget, and this is something that the APC, in fact, was putting forward in their manifesto, and I just want to see how that could work at municipal level. But Ndumiso, one of the things that becomes critical at a time like this is the modeling around the projections that we are seeing and the situation in different metros as well, according to some of the projections may not be in favor of some of the political parties who are hoping to take an outright majority.
That's absolutely correct, Bongiwe, which is why one of our partners for this, electioneering season here at the SABC, the CSIR, are joining us today to, of course, continue making sense of some of the figures that we've been seeing. As you've also mentioned earlier, that the screen is still sitting at about 58% of audited votes there. And of course, joining us from the CSIR is Dr. Ndumiso Cingo, who is the Strategic Partnership Manager there. It's great to have you on the program, sir, and of course, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us on the show today.
Good morning to you and good morning to the viewers.
You know, Doc, I just want to make sense first of the national aggregated vote for the top three parties. Just talk us through that.
Okay, so the trend that we're seeing, firstly, is that the biggest party in the country, which is the ANC, is dropping its total aggregated support when we look at it from 2016 to this year. And in 2016, they stood at 54.5% of all their votes nationally. And this year, we're projecting they'll come down to below 50 at 46.3. Now, looking at the DA, a similar trend actually with the DA as well is dropping from 2016 27% to about 22%. And for the EFF, 8.2% in 2016, and they are increasing their support to 10.6%. So you can see it's a mixed bag, but the biggest parties are having their votes reducing somewhat, and the EFF is coming in. We're seeing other parties come in as well that previously had not done as well in the past, but are seeming to be picking up some votes. So we've got a new party, the Action SA. It's contesting in a very limited number of municipalities, but it's getting some support. We're seeing an increase for the Freedom Front Plus from 0.8% to 2.5%, and the good did not exist in 2016. This year it's getting about 0.6%.
So when we take those numbers that we're busy crunching right now, because I know the last projections were projections was around 11 yesterday. What does this essentially mean? Does this mean that the numbers are showing us that this is still one of the most hotly contested elections?
Yes, the numbers are showing that it's very hotly contested. The projections are indicating that if one looks across all metros in the country, the two metros that seem to be held by the parties that they had held in the majority appears to be Cape Town and on the other hand Buffalo City. So the ANC in Buffalo City seems to have held on to its support there, and the DA in Cape Town. The rest of the municipalities, we seem to be seeing a trend of heading towards coalitions where there's no outright majority by any particular party. So it's an interesting development.
So,
and just to add, there is, for example, in Mangaung, the ANC held that party in 2016. That metro in 2016. At the moment, the projections are that it's hovering at around 50%. So it could go either way. It could go just above or just below 50%. So that's an interesting one that we're watching. At eThekwini as well, we're watching that. And the other metros, of course, previously they were not majority metros, or they were hung metros.
And of course, we're also going to be exploring the whole concept of hung metros. I think Amil Umro, one of our researchers here, is also going to be coming in a bit later on. Let's talk about the metros. The metros are clearly another hot potato during this time.
Yes, and they are a hot potato because they are the biggest urban areas in the country. And we're seeing that there's strong contestation by various parties in those areas, in those metros. We've seen a lot of independence. We've seen a number of new parties coming through. And as you would imagine, those parties, when they come through, when people vote for them, it's a choice between either their traditional support or supporting those new parties. And so you will see some trends there as well.
Dr. Cingo, clearly some new kids on the block, such as your Action SA coming into the likes of Gauteng. What does this really mean now for the space?
I think what one can surmise from that, as I indicated earlier, is that the space is hotly contested. The votes that are available will be split between a number of different parties, and therefore those that originally had bigger support would then naturally be ceding that support, and the numbers essentially show that and reflect that there is some loss of ground for particularly the biggest parties.
Now, in your earlier interviews with one of my colleagues, you spoke about how you found that there was some sort of a convergence of prediction and actual numbers. Talk us through that.
So what happens with the model is that as the votes come in and the voting districts are declared by the IEC, we take those numbers and feed them into the model. In the beginning, the model is a bit unstable when the numbers are relatively low. Once the model stabilizes, for the national elections, it stabilizes at about 5%. For the local government elections, stabilizes at about 10-15%, and in some metros or in some municipalities, about 20%. But once it is stabilized, it stays at that level to the end, just purely by the nature of how it operates. What then happens is that the actual votes counted may show different levels of support based on the outcomes for the different parties. And there may be in the beginning ANC may be leading or DA may be leading, etc. But you find that as time goes on, the differences between what is predicted and what is actual, it is converging. And when we see that, traditionally we've seen that everything, the results, the actuals converge towards the predicted. And we then become comfortable because it means our model is working quite well. And we're seeing that trend where there's the convergence beginning to happen.
That's very interesting, because I was actually just going to go through to my next question in terms of the model itself. How accurate is it?
The model is relatively accurate. Past performance has been quite good. We've started doing this in 1999 with the IEC. Actually, the IEC was interested in detecting any irregularities using a data-driven process. However, later on, we and the SABC saw that this could be something that is of interest to the public, to essentially give them a sense of what the outcome is predicted to be before the voting is completed. And so we've been partnering with SABC since 2004 and for every election since then. Now, the specifics, how accurate it is, it's normally within 1% of the actual results, so the predicted versus the actual. 1% of error, and that 1% we already get it, as I said, with national elections, with 5% of the votes counted. So with only 5% of the total data, we're able already to say to within an accuracy of 1%. Now, some past predictions, so let's take 2019 at the national, the difference between the actual and predicted for ANC was actually 0.3%. And it was the same margin for the DA. So the bigger parties, it predicts quite well for those at national. And for the smaller parties, the error margin is slightly larger, 1 to 2% off of the mark. So we are also watching how things are going to pan out in this election. So in past municipal or local government elections, the model performed relatively well, but there's quite a bit of fluctuation in the prediction because of sometimes new parties coming in, sometimes the pattern of counting, some big areas not coming through early on, and when they get released, they just sort of affect the model prediction one way or another. So for this year, we're looking at the smaller parties, the independents, etc., to see how they're going to do. The bigger parties, we are looking at them as well, and hoping the model will predict as normal. With the smaller parties, one that has been of interest is Action SA. What was interesting with Action SA is that because they chose to only contest in a handful of, I think about 6 metros, or not metros, municipalities. So I think 4 metros and 2 other municipalities. It sort of confounded the model, in the sense that the model normally works well when a party is contesting across a province, because we take the provincial data and use that to aggregate the clustering as I indicated, or to create the clustering as I indicated previously, and then use those clusters to project. So we've done some tweaking on the model to try and accommodate and be able to predict the parties like Action SA and others that may not be contesting all metros. So again, that's a new development. We're looking at how it's going to happen, how it's going to turn out, but we're hoping that it will predict quite well.
Dr. Cingo, now before we let you go, I know we're sitting at 58 audited votes by now. What are we likely to see in the next couple of hours as the numbers keep trickling in?
So, Olisi, I think I'm not in a position to say that. The model is the one that is in a position to tell us that. So when we next update the model, we will give you what the latest projections are, and hopefully we'll see an emerging picture. As I said, the convergence between actual counted and the predicted results.
That was me there trying to put you on the spot. Thank you so much, Dr. Cingo, for joining us this morning. And of course, he will be giving us more updates right here. So you have to stay tuned to SABC News as we continue to give you rolling coverage of the local government elections for 2021.